Why, hello! Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. Great to have you here for this episode. And if you are watching us on YouTube or on Facebook, you'll see that my background's a little different. And the reason is I'm in Connecticut. So I'm actually in the same time zone as the other guys for a change, which is great. Anyway, we had a kind of a surprising thing occur last week where some podcast rating outfit rated us the number one podcast in Connecticut. I don't know what that was about. I was kind of incredulous, but it's flattering.
Especially I thought we were still recording in West Hartford.
That's right. That's right. Anyway, we at least have one guy in Connecticut, so we can count him. I'm here every few months. Anyway, well, thank you for tuning into the Theology Pugcast, as I noted, and I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest on the other side of the country. So I've got two homes, and I'm at my Connecticut home this week. And anyway, that's enough for that. I had a piece come out in The Blaze this past week, which was fun to see. And if you want to check that out, I don't imagine it's too difficult to find. But it's gotten a lot of buzz, I was told, by the Blaze people. So I was pleased for that. Anyway, and I'm working on a book on artificial intelligence. Okay, Glenn, why don't you tell us about yourself?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a professor emeritus of Renaissance and Reformation early modern European history at Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And I have my own ministry where I do freelance teaching as well as writing. And I've got a bunch of things in the works right now, too.
Great. So, Tom, tell us about yourself and then take us into the subject of the day because it's your day.
Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics, and philosophy here and there. One place is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I always have my hand in about 10 different things as well, getting a few writing projects wrapped up, getting others in more depth. So that leads to today's topic, I guess. One of my longer goals, and it does take time, and that's okay because I'm doing a lot of work with it, is I am adding to a Christian ethics book a substantive amount of engagement with views of the doctrine of humanity, not only philosophical ones and contemporary ones, but also classic Christian ones, and retrieving the rich things and trying to build the richest, most comprehensive Christian case for doing certain types of ethics that Christians have always wanted or tried their best to do. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the relationship, of course, to ourselves as beings that know and think and act on intelligence, but also the connection of that with our capacity to speak, communicate, use language the unique way that we do. And I think it is always a timely topic. I think one good reason would be just in the areas of technology, which we've all talked about and are writing about. I have a good quote by Elon Musk some years back, who predicted that language would become obsolete. He envisions a Neuralink device directly inserted in the brain, allowing people to share thoughts without the mediation of speaking and listening. And let's see here. Tech Reporters, this article says, gleefully shared this as a bold prophecy of progress.
Well, yeah, I've noticed that some of those tech gurus and reporters have turned on him like a bunch of hyenas. But anyway, so how far back was that?
This was probably around 2020. So
okay, while he was still considered progressive.
Yeah, that's right. He was still in their acceptable camp.
That's right.
And but I think the interesting thing, of course, is the kind of Cartesian perspective that we understand.
Yeah. The thing that first comes to my mind is I actually think in words. You know, I don't just like think with emotions or in pictures. I actually think in words a lot of the time.
Yeah.
You know, words are kind of going through my head all the time.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see Lewis today write The Abolition of Man in a much more pronounced engagement with the role of language,
Right.
being someone who understood it well.
Yeah, what he's actually kind of dealing with, it seems to me, is a kind of mediated telepathy.
Yeah.
But even
or telepathy, perhaps would be a better way of saying it.
Well, yeah, that's my point. I actually think in words, so it sounds like he's wanting to, like, we share our feelings. What is he talking about?
So the way he puts it is, technology will render our, the capacity or need to mouth noises as unnecessary. And they don't, of course, like the spoken speech. That may be. And then it said, will render this unnecessary. And one day, traditional speech will have gone the way of the campfires, utilized only for sentimental reasons.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What's interesting here is the speech. The speech really shapes thought. I don't think he really appreciates the degree to which our language, both vocabulary and even the structures of the language, affect the way we actually think. There's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which says that language shapes thought, not the other way around. And there's a good amount of evidence for that. So I don't know exactly how you bypass it. Yeah. I mean, unless he's thinking that we are going to communicate with words via the computer without actually producing sounds. I mean, maybe that's what he's saying here, but I doubt it. I suspect he's really looking for more unmediated transmission of ideas with unmediated by language. And that I don't think is possible.
Yeah, of course it makes sense from the angle of the splits that happen in Western thought between the Cartesian world, and then the other group gets basically lumped into making all language about sort of just feeling and kind of emotions. And they get very disconnected. So they're looked at by those usually in the sciences with a lack of trust, or it's mainly just ornament rather than communicating something that you could basically communicate without the need for it. And it's peculiar in the article I was quoting that it had to do especially with spoken and speech that exits and makes a sound. They weren't talking sort of like sign language, for example, or bodily gesture. But I imagine I would be curious to see how they interpret those things as just behaviors, or if they're communicative in ways that are similar to, though different than, human speech. But one of the things that we've talked about enough on the show, and I think it's probably good to tie some threads together, is the notion of someone like Tolkien, where he talks about co-creating, or this notion of the artist as maker. And we talk a lot about the poet, right, and the imagination. Well, one of the things, I think it was Robert Sherman is the name, he wrote an interesting book called The Participatory Turn in Religious Studies in Particular. I am sorry, having a cat attack. Sorry.
What did the cat say?
Yeah, the cat's trying to communicate by attacking the other cat. Anyway, that may happen again. Sorry. So anyway, Sherman notes that there's a lot of retrieval work going on in theology and religion, because the way that Western thought has taken things, it's really created a problem to even make sense of the religious world, much less anything else. But in theology, it has really shown that what it understood by creation and a very rich notion of reason, and thought and language tied to the way in which all things share in existence and creation, those things got lost. And you end up with something like Musk following this one line of Cartesian notion of the human is basically just Well, it ends up with the human being becomes like a functional computer. And then the flip side, then you have is just kind of the behaviorists, where it is doing nothing but responding to stimuli. And you're not able to integrate most of the things we experience and do. And then you end up in these very odd places that lose so much of what we should have as humans and life. So one of the things he talks about is the different types of participation that Christians, for example, have held to. One would be kind of the formal participation, which means we sort of share in the different kinds of forms that are in the divine mind, right? You have trees, you have birds. These things aren't arbitrary. They have real essences that hold while they are in that form, and they can be traced back to not their material natures only, but into something intelligible. And then you have the kind of Thomas Aquinas approach, which talks about everything basically owing its being to that which has to be the source of all being, right? And so all the things that theologians will talk about when they talk about perfections, like goodness or truth or beauty, those things, again, can't be reduced just to material and the unintelligible. They actually are made sense of most fully by this understanding that they all are limited sharings in something that is that by nature. Well,
I remember studying Aristotle, and maybe it was actually touching on Aquinas. You never really encounter material reality without form. It's not like you come across something that's just a pile of material reality.
Yeah,
it's always informed by something.
That's right. It's always just what his term would be potential. But even there, it's almost what you could call undifferentiated being. Almost nothing. Is really the way of putting it. It's no thing, no essence, no form. But the last one is the way in which participation focuses on the way that human beings in particular are co-creative. They participate in the imaginative and creative dimensions in a limited way, but in a real way, in which when we do creative things and we do things that contribute to the making sense of and the drawing together of creation, we are mimicking our creator in the ways we've been granted a gift to be able to. And this kind of goes back to Genesis, right? I mean, we have basically Adam receives a defining task, is the way Dave Schindler puts it. Out of the ground, the Lord formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. So here is a sense in which the human being has been given a share in the work of God, not in creating it, not really in even giving it what it is, but allowing his name to contribute to his naming of it to contribute to the way in which it's going to be brought into the meaning context that is going to define creation.
Yeah, let me just reflect on this a little bit, because as an artist and as a writer who writes, fiction as well as nonfiction, occasionally I'll come across a person who has zero tolerance for the arts, and they'll say. And I'm not just referring to people who are not Christians. Sometimes these people are Christians, and they'll say something like, "That's such a waste of time." Only the thing. Only soul winning kind of matters, because if you win a soul, and I agree with this, there's an eternal, sort of benefit that someone enjoys. So in other words, this is something that won't pass away. Everything else passes away. So, people will say things like, well, why should we care about, say, church buildings? Isn't it just what's going on in our hearts that matters, and everything else is just incidental or unimportant? Or, why did you spend any time on that work of fiction that you're working on? I even have family members who
you should just be out on a box preaching the gospel 24/7 at the grocery store.
But pretty much that's the way they think. And one of the ways I address this or respond to this, as I say, no, what I've done will live on. Yes, the physical object will pass away, but the mind of God will retain the creation. In other words, it is eternal. Now, is it perfect? Is it something that is of equal significance to the salvation of soul? Of course not. I'm not implying that.
Yeah,
But go ahead.
I've described, generally speaking, the good things that we do in this world, our good works, as well as your creative type things, as God's refrigerator art.
That's right.
It's not like it. Sure. It's not like they have intrinsic value, that by themselves eternally, but they're valued in that they're produced by someone that God loves.
Well, I think that's true. At the same time, Leaf by Nigel is a very interesting book or story to reflect on, because in that we find Nigel, when he's in eternity, he comes upon the tree that he's been painting.
Right.
And, the unresolved question is was the tree always there, or is it there because Nigel painted it? I've always been inclined to think the second, insofar as I do believe that there's a sense in which, of course, he's drawing on a heavenly vision, but at the same time, when we're talking about cause and effect, Nigel is an idea in God's mind too. In other words, these things don't have to be so antithetical to each other that we can't figure out ways that they can both be true at once. So, in a sense, you could say that yes, the tree was always in God's mind, but Nigel was always in God's mind too, and Nigel was always going to be the means by which the tree came into being, even in the eternal realm. But aren't we drawing on the transcendentals when we make good art?
Well, that's it. I mean, this is you participating in the radical generosity of creation, and you yourself exhibiting the kind of self-giving out of that generosity that you're sharing in, that is God's very the nature of God's being. And there is a creative plenitude to that, so that just as the fullness of God's being is expressed in this magnificent creativity of self-giving and generosity, we get to participate that as a grace, and that is never a loss. But then there is the kind of the new covenant aspects of God's building a temple. He is the foundational stone, but whatever we do in Christ's name, that means bringing his light, the fullness. I think Scripture puts it as his fullness, basically, where he will fill all things. So that means just as we have a mission in Genesis to to have dominion and priests of creation under God's lordship, so we also have a share in the mission. And that mission is not just about proclaiming the good news so that people can go to heaven. It's also about that abundant life that comes in Christ, and the way that will permeate the creation starting now until it becomes that new, if you will, dwelling place. And Scripture talks often about you're building on this, right? Wood, hay, and stubble is the stuff that isn't done out of that abundance. And the other stuff, gold, silver, precious stones, these things are things God treasures as part of the generosity that we're sharing in Christ. So I think there is definitely not a loss of the creative. It's probably even made more profound.
Well, I think related to this, though, that when we think about, say, the Reformed, it's been observed that there's a certain cast of mind that finds Reformed theology very appealing. The engineers, the accountants, those sorts of people. But there's also a misanthrope who finds Reformed theology appealing, and because of the doctrine of divine sovereignty. And they interpret divine sovereignty in this way. You know what? God does it all, and he doesn't need us in any respect, which is absolutely true. And so consequently, we don't need to think about, like practical things like how things get done. You think about William Carey, his whole argument with the people who didn't want to be engaged in missions was God sovereignly uses people.
Yeah. Sovereignty is about governing.
That's right. And I come across these people who have got this. I interpret it actually as a kind of contempt for humanity.
There is.
They relish the doctrines of total depravity and the worthlessness of our works. I mean, they delight in sort of this stuff.
I've run into it too. It is a kind of a sickness that can spread, and I don't think it's fair to the better of the Reformed tradition at all.
I don't think it's the spirit of the Reformed tradition.
That's right.
But there's a way in which the Reformed tradition can lend itself to that misanthropic way of looking at things.
Yeah. Two things occur to me here. One of them is, getting back to Leaf by Niggle. Another place that you see this, and I think that this is for me a real rather important one, is in the Silmarillion with the creation of the dwarves.
Yeah.
Yes.
Aule, the smith of the gods, creates the dwarves. He wasn't supposed to do that. They were a little bit. They were premature. They shouldn't have been. They shouldn't have come out at that point. And God says, no, you aren't going to put them in before the elves are there because they're my firstborn. And he says, oh well, maybe I should just destroy them. Wouldn't that be better? And God says, no, I will give them life, but they're going to come in their proper time.
Mm-hmm.
So he takes what his creation creates and adopts it.
Yeah. I love that scene where, he is raising his hammer to destroy the dwarves.
And the dwarves are shrinking away from him.
Right.
It's interesting. I was actually preaching a sermon this past Sunday on the text in John's Gospel 21, where Peter is out fishing, right, and goes back to fishing, waiting for Jesus to come back and tell him what to do, basically. So he does. They all jump in the boat, and they end up empty-handed. They have nothing at the end of the day, night. Morning rises, Jesus on the shore. They don't recognize him. He says, put the net on the other side of the boat. Miracle.
Hey, put it on the other side of the boat.
Yeah. For expert fishermen, that had to be pride break. But check this out. So they come in, they finally drag it all in, and then Peter finally says, "Oh, let me help." But the funny thing is, there's already a meal cooking. Jesus is the one who gave them all the fish in the boat. All they did is hauled it in. Okay, but Jesus says something interesting. He says, bring the fish you caught and add it to the meal.
Interesting. I never noticed that.
Yeah, he tells them, take the fish that you caught, even though he supplied it.
Yeah.
But they this is the sharing in of mission, just like it is the sharing in of what we're going on here. They're asymmetrical. That's our bow to the Reformed. Sure. They're asymmetrical. We owe it all to God, but God is including us by grace in this beautiful thing called his mission. The abide and go. You're abiding, you owe it all to him, and yet he sends you just as the Father sent him, right? In his name. You're doing it in his name. And so what you do and all the things that you do out of the abundant life you now have in Christ are part of the things that he's basically saying, bring this and add it to the feast we're about to make. And we're going to, and there are hints that that's a Eucharistic meal as well.
Well, think about the Eucharist. I mean, bread and wine both obviously are the result of the fruit of the soil, but with human contributions. You don't get bread. I mean, you just don't walk outside and say, I just saw a loaf of bread. I picked it off the tree.
This isn't manna.
Or wine for that matter. I mean, yes, obviously grapes, but there's a great deal of cultivating and preparation. And, of course, the most important contribution is the one that God makes. We wouldn't have wine without grapes or fermentation.
That's right. None of it. But this is where it's interesting because the classic view of creation is they're not on competition with each other.
Right.
God is the source of it all, even us. But we get to share in it as gifts.
Right.
But baptism is just pure water.
Well, that's true.
We don't add anything to that, but that's important theologically.
It is. And notice what Peter does before he goes to the shore. He jumps into the water to Christ.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, we're back to the beginning because Peter's initial call occurred after the miraculous catch of fish.
Yeah.
He's at a charcoal fire. That's a word that is used only in this instance, and in John at the charcoal fire at the
at the
high
betrayal
priest's house.
Yeah,
at the betrayal.
Yeah.
And the word for charcoal there apparently is something that you wouldn't normally use for cooking because it's got a distinctive smell and things like that.
Yeah.
So Jesus is bringing him to the beginning and to the betrayal. And then you get the 3 "Do you love me?" and the responses but then the call to Peter to feed my sheep, to feed my lambs. It's once again cooperation.
Yeah,
right.
And it's something. Yeah, he's getting included in what Jesus just did for them, fed them, and I think the hints are all right there, all the way back in Genesis, where we have this notion we're invited to name things. And it says that whatever the man called every living creature, that would be its name. So again, it didn't mean that any of that was arbitrary. This isn't just the social construction all the way down. Some will talk about. There's a way in which creation evokes certain ways of speaking about it and thinking about it. So the creation itself has its own, if you will, symbolic posturing.
I like to think a little bit about a couple of things that are wrinkles here that can maybe provide us a reason to just kind of maybe take this in a direction that may seem a little kind of like what Musk is talking about. So think about Lord of the Rings. At the very end, you have this entourage heading to the Grey Havens. And there's an evening in which Gandalf, Elrond, and Galadriel are all sitting around the fire, if I remember correctly, and they're communicating with each other, but without words. It's telepathic. Telepathic. That's the word, right? I've been drinking a little bit of this stuff here, double Citra. This is a hooker. So I'm back in Connecticut. So
that'll do it.
I'm back in Connecticut where I can get a hooker. Anyway, Hooker, by the way, Thomas Hooker was a Reformed minister, and there's actually a brewery in Hartford named for him.
We have to get a Richard Hooker. We have to get a Richard Hooker here too.
Yeah,
I'm working on that.
I remember when we were recording at I think it was Artisanal Burgers. When during the recording, you asked for another hooker.
That's right. I just wanted people to know what I was really talking about. But there's that episode where you have this. They're sitting by the fire. They're interacting, but I don't think that implies that somehow speech is a problem. Maybe the way to think about it is that speech is sort of the first phase. So another thing to think about is the fact that many of the mystical, people in our Christian tradition, the mystics, they're longing for this direct, unmediated communion with God. And I wonder how that informs our thinking too.
Well, and I think that, one of the things I think the giveaways in Christian theology is the fact that we're dealing with Logos, who is communicative all the way down. And so we're definitely not talking, even in the contemplative, we're not talking about something that is not bound up with speech in some way. It is how we understand that that's important. And so being made in the image of God, therefore, means there is a certain way in which we share in, as creatures, in a analogous way, the Logos nature of all things. The whole creation does in some way. But we are really the ones that are given this endowment of naming, and our language being able to take on these dimensions. And of course, this plays largely into the way in which we interact with the created world in such fundamental ways, but these become ways in which God interacts with us as we interact with that world. Think of the liturgy and think of in music and all of these things that are directed to God and become the place where God dwells with us in our earthly time. And so this, a lot of this would be a contribution, especially of the Reformed, to a lot of thinking about the beatific vision, but they always want to emphasize, rightfully so, that it is Christologically mediated, and that means through the incarnate Son. It's seeing the God face to face in the face of Christ.
Right.
And so, now how, it's not that you can't skip over.
Right.
This
is an interesting thing to think about as well. When you think about the visual arts, of course, there's been a great deal of debate within Reform circles about images of Jesus. Yeah. So, we have, a command not to make images, and yet, we live in an image-saturated culture.
Okay, yeah. Chris, I'm going to stop you there.
Okay.
If we take the first half of the second commandment literally, then we can't have images of anything, period.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
And the second half of it is don't bow down and worship them. That's the controlling factor here. Right. So are you allowed to do an image of Jesus as a human being that you don't bow down and worship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's I think a live question. But it's interesting to see how Islam takes this. Mm. So in Islam, there's a kind of tendency to favor highly mathematically enriched images,
geomorphs,
right.
Plant images, those kinds of things early on. That changes over time, but early on, that's definitely what they're doing.
But when you look at, say, a mosque, at least one of the classic and beautiful mosques, that you look up and you just see all of this really powerfully enriching lattice work and very sophisticated weavings, and sort of the imagery of that. Even so, you're still dealing with an image. You're not dealing with an image, say, of an animal or a person, but you're dealing with something that is communicating visually.
Yeah, there are a couple of other things that I think are important here, though, because I want to pull it back to word. I think you're right that everything we make speaks. Okay, but I actually, in one of the chapters in my book on the image of God, I was talking about creativity. And I argued there, and I think I'm correct here, that the place where our creativity is most like God's is in the use of words. In the creation of story, in the creation, in Tolkien's case, of an entire world and so on. Because how does God create? He creates by speaking.
Right.
So I think word is really important. Now, that brings me to the fallen example of this. And I don't think people pay quite enough attention to this, the Tower of Babel.
Yeah. Okay.
And where I'm going to start is not with the confusion of the languages, but I'm going to start with the motivation.
Right.
Let us make a name for ourselves.
Yeah.
Right.
They want to name themselves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which means asserting their own identity, defining themselves, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Right.
And it is obviously intimately connected with word. So what happens? They want to make a name for themselves, and God says, "Oh, really? Well, let's confuse your language and see how that works out for you."
Right.
So and then immediately afterwards, he calls Abram and who was from the tribe of Shem, a word that means name.
Right.
And he says, "I will make a name for you." Right. So God is making a name for Abram from the tribe of Shem, in contradistinction to what's going on in Babel, where they want to make Hashem a name for themselves. And he confuses the language as a result. Yeah. I mean, so there's a whole lot of things going on there that really surround language.
Well,
Right.
language, definition, meaning,
Yeah.
all of those things.
And it's interesting because the naming of God, the way that functions in Scripture, is profound in relationship to what humans get to say and can't say. You talk about where using the name of the Lord your God in vain, or trying to reference God in a way that He hasn't self-named or given the permission. Now, but juxtapose that with the Psalms, because in the worship and in communion, David uses almost any kind of creaturely metaphor to relate to and express how rich the creator of all things are. The Lord is a strong tower, right? I mean, I can hear the reformer, well, God didn't say it was okay for you to call him a strong tower, so you're not allowed to do it. So you have to scrap the Psalms now. But here you really have this going on. But when you get to Moses' encounter at the burning bush, you have the self-naming of God. You have something where basically Moses says, what name am I going to go tell your people, right, that you're going to be delivered under? In other words, how are you going to distinguish yourself as the living God from all the other ones they hear plenty about over in Egypt? Right. And that there isn't, and God gives himself a very distinct name at that point. But with that name is also tied that reality. So if you use it improperly, it carries with it a lot of consequences. And then likewise, you hear the Trinity, it becomes a filling out of that name in the New Testament, and the protection of it. And so we often don't think of, why does just saying words and sounds the right way have that kind of connection and consequence?
Yeah, well, I do think that there is a tendency that maybe is the result of our sinfulness, where many of the things we say just don't have any weight. They're lies. Because they're lies, they have no substance. They've got, as I said, no weight. And so there's a tendency to denigrate speaking, mere words. In other words, to say, oh, that's not what really counts. What really counts is something else. But at the same time, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So there is a way that words are connected to the Godhead that we have to acknowledge if we're Christians anyway.
And that means there's a kind of divine eloquence behind everything.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, G.K. Chesterton commented at one point something to the effect of, people say you shouldn't fight about words. Words are about the only thing worth fighting about.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, he was great for stuff like that. Yeah, I wish he was on Twitter today. He'd have a following of 35 million people.
Well, actually, the one I wish was on Twitter was Martin Luther.
Oh yeah, he would be another one with a big following.
That would be simultaneously hysterical and horrifying.
Well, it's interesting because I know you probably, any of you who hear Ken Myers from time to time, had Dave Schindler's work on there recently. Social media is hate speech.
That's right.
And it actually is going after some of this notion that when you understand how connected to reality, God and humans are to words, and the way that social media treats words, you start to see this, just like you were talking about, sort of a misanthropic dimension in reform circles. You have a sort of hatred of that aspect of our nature by the way language is so abused.
Right. At the same time, everybody wants to post their thoughts.
Yeah, well, and I think that's what that's an interesting thing right there, though, because on the one hand, it's an affirmation that we want our thoughts to be heard. This is fundamental to us, but there is a way of cheapening that and working against it, even by exercising it. And I think that's one of the ironies, I think, that we pick up here. Is it's just like Musk at this time. He's using language to communicate how profound it's going to be when we can't use language.
or we don't need to use it anymore.
Yeah, that's it. Although he bought X.
That's right. Which is all about 128 characters. If I remember correctly. Right.
Yeah. Now, the interesting question I have here, this is one of the ones that occurred to me earlier. When he's talking about not using language, not making the grunts and things like that we do with our voice. What does he do with writing?
Mm-hmm.
Is writing included in our? I mean, one would think if it's all done through Neuralink, writing would be included.
Right.
But he didn't seem to address that particular issue.
It's interesting because Plato did, right? And this worried him sometimes because of the way in which it can become removed from the writer.
Right.
And this is I think a good analogy is what happens to creation when you rip it from the creator, right? It starts to become construct then, and it can become a very dangerous thing at that point.
Right.
It either becomes a construct or it becomes God.
Yes. Yeah.
But one of the things I think Schindler is getting at when he is criticizing social media is the disembodied character of it, and the sense in which we take these words and don't lose, or we lose the connection of those words to a person.
Yeah.
I think that it's really hard to treat people. It's not impossible. I mean, we've seen plenty of examples of people treating other people badly in person. But when you do that, there's a level of, I guess, passionate, and I mean that in the worst sense, kind of giving yourself over to your passions when you treat someone physically badly. So, like, you think about a road rage incident where you've got people who are in their cars and they've made each other mad, and they're shouting obscenities at each other. That's pretty unusual. Most of the time, people are fairly circumspect about how to say things if a person is physically present. They're concerned about how they're being heard and understood or not. And there's not so much of that with social media. I mean, it sort of takes the road rage thing to a new kind of virtual reality where people, treat each other or treat the words in such a way that we say to each other without the kind of sympathy and I guess awareness that a human being is behind the words that you normally take for granted in a conversation.
Well, that's it. I mean, some will call it sort of, words are the sensuous symbol. I mean, in the sense that they have, when connected to the people that you're connected with, they have, I don't even know how the best way to put it, but that is where everything is taking place. If you can damage or disconnect that relationship, then you can say and do whatever at whatever consequence and with any damage. And you can do this with reality. That's what we do now. I mean, we fabricate 2 + 2 can be 5.
Well, I think about the fact that, we get together every week, and if one of you says something that I don't agree with, my first impulse is, I wonder what, they meant.
Yeah.
Not so much just respond to the statement, but, because I know you, and I have a strong conviction that you're good men, and then I want to have the appropriate sort of framework to understand what you said.
Yeah. Yeah, even when you get on the social media world, you have followers and everything else. It becomes sort of a very thin type of friendship. I mean, they like everything I write. Great, they're in my camp, or they appreciate kind of what I'm saying, and that has its own appeal. But on the other side, there isn't anything richer. Right. And I've wrestled with this itself with the whole of social media. It has tons of advantages of getting ideas out and people talking about things, and people at home across the world that don't get access to certain conversations and they benefit from them. All kinds of good things. And some of them even feel like they know you. I've gone to places
where people,
little crowds come around, and then they'll come up and then you look and you're like, you kind of feel like you know them too, and you've never met them. There are connections there. But I think it's easy to dismiss that. But I don't even know if that's so true, any different than the way we're treating each other when we go to the grocery store anymore. I mean,
Well, there's that. There's the sort of momentary encounter.
yeah,
You get that, say, on the subway. When
yeah,
you're like I remember I took the subway every day, and people who aren't used to, say, a very dense urban environment, they're put off by the lack of sort of friendliness and stuff like that.
yeah,
But there's only so many people you can.
yeah, yeah. Can't have a good conversation with everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, you can be cordial.
Yeah,
But you realize, like, when you're on the train with somebody, I will never see this person again in my life, even though we may take the same train every day.
yeah,
It's unlikely we will ever see each other again in a place like Boston
yeah,
or New York. So there is that. I also think that what we've seen in the 2000s is kind of the democratization of something that goes all the way back to writing itself. So even before the printing press, there were famous writers, Homer,
yeah,
and you think of Dante, you think about Virgil. I mean, there were people whose reputations were enormous, even though we didn't have the wherewithal to print out cheaply millions of copies when it comes to their books. I was just reading something here Sunday. I get the Wall Street Journal weekend edition, and they had something on Mark Twain. What a character!
yeah, yeah.
He was the savviest self promoter. You could the whole white suit thing, that was all thought out. It was
Tom Wolfe didn't come up with that.
Yeah, he didn't come up with that. He was paying tribute to his predecessor. But I mean, it was all about self-promotion. And he actually talked very forthrightly about envy and wanting to be envied, which was striking to me.
Yeah.
Here's a guy, 19th, early 20th century, just, a huge chasm between his time and ours. And yet he had some of the same vices.
Oh, you can go back to the Renaissance. Somebody like Petrarch.
Yeah.
Petrarch is one of these people that's really slippery to actually get hold of, because he knew everything that he wrote would be read by other people. And he always wrote to manage the impressions of people who are reading about him or reading what he's writing.
Yeah.
So you can never really be sure when you're reading Petrarch, when he's doing something autobiographical or talking about what he's thinking or anything like that. You can never be sure whether you're actually reading what he was thinking or feeling, or just what he wanted you to think he was thinking or feeling.
Right.
I mean,
right.
this goes way back. I mean, even before Twain.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
But there's definitely something that, to me, that reiterates the whole point here, even if it's in its fallen form, is that it has this effect on us because we are so made for it. And so, there's all kinds you can do. This is why rhetoric works. This is why propaganda works. This is why we can talk ourselves into things. But there is this, I mean, there are a lot of things we didn't tease out, and we won't have the chance to, but I was thinking at different dimensions. Like when you were mentioning, Chris, the fact that things have been written down a long time, I was also remembering that speech and talking and telling story goes back, of course, from the beginning. And handing it down that way before they were able to do it in different ways often. And even today, I mean, I go to, I'll visit my wife's originally from Colombia, and I'll visit family there. And they have people who will stand up and tell stories that have been told for generations. They memorize their poets. They memorize these things, and they all know them, and they all share in them. Yeah. And there is this connectedness, that this sharing in a tradition, in a sensuous word, if you will, something that draws everyone's senses in and themselves in that way, that is just profound about the way we are. We don't typically see, I have cats around here, they're fighting each other. They communicate in some way, but they're not telling stories. They're not telling stories.
Right. Well, thinking about what you just noted, there is a cast of mind. It's a particularly modern cast of mind, which can't reconcile truth and fiction, or truth and myth, or truth and story.
Yeah.
For these people, truth is purely factual. I was just listening to something that Noah Yuval Harari was saying here the other day. Now, there's a case, but I mean, he exemplifies this. He recognizes the power of stories, but in his mind, because they're not, understood as sort of a set of facts, they're entirely fictitious and essentially lies. So the only kind of truth that he can entertain is kind of the truth of logical positivism. That kind of very thin, superficial, unappealing, weak.
See, the problem with it is he doesn't understand, or he does, and he just doesn't want to accept that logical positivism is just as metaphorical all the way down as any other language.
Well, yeah, and we could do a deep dive on that.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking about he's not alone.
Yeah.
In fact, some of these misanthropes that I was talking about earlier with regard to art have more in common with Yuval Harari than they have with the Apostle Paul.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is. And there is a long thread of dualism in the West in particular that wants to split apart the capacity of creaturely things to be able to carry truth, things that are creative, things that are story, things that are ritual or rite or symbol. All these things are looked at suspiciously as somehow they're in dualist competition with kind of some pure concept or pure idea. And so what you have there is, even with Revelation, you have revelatory positivism, that God just sort of speaks this clear as day, rational, propositional speech into the world, and there is, no flowering around it. And it could literally.
I remember my education, and as a young student, I didn't want anything to do with the Psalms.
Yeah.
I just wanted Paul.
Yeah.
I mean, I was even impatient with John.
All that metaphor.
Yeah, I just wanted propositions. I didn't want witticisms. I was even exasperated by the Gospels. With the stories and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I've come a long way, but but anyway, I don't think I'm all that. I was all that unusual.
Yeah, the thing that Harari and others need to remember is that, well, several things. First of all language is done on the basis of analogy or metaphor. But then along with that, the word myth in Greek, mythos, really refers to a story.
Right.
It's one of a couple of words that mean a story. And he's got his own myths.
Right.
I talk a lot of times, or when I was teaching, I would talk about the secular creation myth.
Right.
And it's their explanation of where the world comes from, and it's a just so story.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The key is for us is logos and mythos don't have to be in opposition.
Right.
They don't have to be dualistically severed. It could be actually the way in which logos manifests itself that is right there in the heart of the way the creaturely functions, and that is in terms of story and language and music and all of these different things that exhibit what being a creature of this creator, of this eternal logos, and the richness of what it means to be a creative God.
So there's a caveat that we need to add, and that is that there is such a thing as a bad story.
Oh yeah. And a false one.
That's right. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. And there's also such thing as bad logic.
And bad language, not just bad words.
Right. Reason can mislead us just as much as imagination can.
Yeah.
Well, you remember Chesterton's favorite quip about, the madman is the man who has nothing but his reason.
Yeah.
I keep, excuse me, I keep coming back to Lewis's comment about reason is the natural organ of truth, understood in a limited way, but imagination is the organ of meaning.
Yeah.
I instead of truth, I would prefer if he would have said facts, but because the way we find meaning in the world is through the stories we tell. We are really narrative creatures. We produce stories that explain meaning, that explain what's going on. It isn't just a collection of an assemblage of facts. We connect those facts into different kinds of stories and use those stories to tell us what things mean.
Right. That doesn't mean that every collection is equally valuable.
Oh, no.
Right.
No. And that's a point. When I was teaching worldview, I used to make the point regularly that not all worldviews are created equal.
Right.
Some of them correspond to reality better than others.
Right.
Yeah. And as fallen creatures, we do like to eclipse the truth and hide from it and run from it. And we do that in our stories and our behaviors and our gestures and our music. So all of those things are true. I love, you talk about Calvin coming up with a good metaphor. Man is an idol-making factory. I mean, that is a great metaphor to describe something very true of our fallen natures. We do like to create things from and name things the wrong way. I mean, we're doing it now in the whole naming of ourselves and who we are and our identity and gender and pronouns and all of this. We're constantly trying to have control over reality, construct it ex nihilo, rather than receiving it, hearing an echo of it, and learning how to use language to correspond to that reality in its richness.
Yeah. I just saw something here today from Portland. I'm here in Connecticut, but back in Oregon. Riley Gaines, I guess, is delivering a talk in Portland, and there have been threats on her life from the trans activists who essentially, in their way of thinking, if you don't affirm the name that they give to themselves, you're killing them. And so they have a right to kill you back. I mean, literally, that's the way these people think.
Yeah. Well, and here we go. This is hyper. You talk about language use. This is hyper fundamentalism that makes an identity between the pronoun and the person.
Yeah.
I mean, look. I mean, we all know how language works, but look, any sound and something that isn't a sound are not identical. It's a metaphor. They're all metaphors. There are some sounds that have the reason that they have been used and adopted and handed down is because they have moved beyond just interacting with creation into a full meaning web of reality and understanding that makes sense of those realities, right? But for me to use a sound and say that it's going to kill you is basically saying you're identical. You're more fundamentalist than a fundamentalist at that point.
Yeah,
that's the basic point.
Yeah, I don't like many of the things that maybe I associate with Thomas Jefferson, but wasn't he kind of known for this distinction between words and your physical well-being? In other words, wasn't it the letter to the Danbury Baptists that he kind of laid out, his interest in preserving the freedom to speak because of the fact that it doesn't break your leg? Anyway,
they're not. That's right. They're not. It's not an identical kind of pain, and it is interesting also the way in which this is back to what we talked about last week with universities is almost the way in which we are so about buffering anyone from any kind of psychological suffering, which cuts off the very conditions for growing as a human being, period.
Right. Yeah.
Whether it's learning or anything else.
That's why there's so many of these people are infantile. I mean, I mean, we see it throughout Scripture. In Hebrews, God disciplines his children, and it's a good thing. In other words, there's a degree of discomfort that a loving father will put his kids through in order to help them grow.
And when we don't do that, language becomes a threat to people in that level. They haven't had to confront the uncomfortableness of somebody maybe saying something that hurt your feelings, or somebody, not saying these are all pleasant things to go through.
Right.
But if we don't go through them, we do end up with this tyrannical spirit where we want the whole world to have to cave to what will make us feel happy and safe in the world.
Right. Well, that's a good note to end on there, Tom. So thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. You've gotten all the way to the end, and your reward is to hear me talk about Patreon. We could really use your help. And if you would consider a regular support or a regular gift to the Theology Pugcast on a monthly basis, it would really be great, because there are bills to pay. It's not as though people take our program and make it ready for folks to listen to for nothing. And anyway, if you would consider that, we'd appreciate it. And there's a link in the show notes. But that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye.